Dad! What happened to you? Who did this to you?
You never abandoned me?
Rosie, I searched for you my whole life. I thought I lost you forever.
Caleb Mercer came home rich from abroad, carrying a leather suitcase, a private driver's number, and almost 10 years of guilt he had learned to call responsibility. He thought his father was safe. He thought the money he sent every month had kept Harold Mercer warm, fed, and cared for. Then his car passed an abandoned gas station outside Tacoma, and Caleb saw an old man asleep behind a cracked concrete wall covered with a blue tarp. 1 second later, he saw the man's face. It was his father. And the worst part was not that Harold was there. It was that Harold looked ashamed to be found. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. A few weeks earlier, Caleb had still believed he had done everything right. From the 34th floor of his office in Singapore, Washington State felt like another life. The rain, the cold mornings, the narrow kitchen where his father used to drink black coffee before work, the old house on Alder Street with its sagging porch and maple tree roots pushing through the sidewalk. Caleb had not seen that house in nearly 10 years, but he paid for it. That was what he told himself whenever guilt came too close. He had paid the back taxes when the county sent warnings. He had covered the mortgage when Harold's retirement savings ran thin. He had wired money every month without missing once. Some months it was enough for groceries and utilities. Later, when Caleb's company grew, he sent more. Enough for repairs, enough for medical bills, enough, he believed, for dignity. His younger sister, Denise, handled the details. She lived close. She was practical. She had always been the one who stayed. Caleb was the one who left. At first, leaving had been survival. He was 28 when a logistics firm in Singapore offered him a job that paid more in a year than he could earn in 5 back home. Harold had been proud, though he tried not to show it too much. His father was a retired mechanic. A quiet man with thick hands, bad knees, and a habit of measuring love by what he fixed instead of what he said. At the airport that morning, Harold had hugged Caleb once hard and quick. Go build something, he had said. Don't waste your shot worrying about an old man. Caleb believed him. That was the first mistake. Years passed. The job became a startup. The startup became a company. The company became the kind of thing investors chased and magazines wrote about. Caleb Mercer became a name people used in rooms he had never entered. When a global shipping group bought his software platform, the headlines called him a billionaire. Caleb did not feel like one. He still woke up some mornings thinking about the old kitchen in Tacoma, about his mother Margaret, who had died 6 years earlier from a stroke that came too fast and left everyone stunned. About Harold sitting alone after the funeral, holding her reading glasses in one hand, like he did not know where to put them. After Margaret died, Caleb had offered to move Harold into a senior community. Harold refused. He said he wanted to stay in the house. It was the last place that still smelled like her. Denise said she would check on him. I'm here, she told Caleb over the phone. You just focus on your work. Dad doesn't need you flying back every time a pipe leaks. Caleb wanted to believe that because believing it made his life possible. So he sent money. Denise sent updates. Dad is fine. Dad saw the doctor. Dad needs a new water heater. Dad says stop worrying. Sometimes Caleb asked to video call, but Harold never seemed available. He was sleeping. He was at the hardware store. He was having a rough day. Denise always had an answer, and Caleb always accepted it because he was busy, tired, and far away. Distance has a way of making neglect look like trust. He did not understand that then. The decision to return came suddenly. The sale of his company had closed on a rainy Thursday. There were champagne glasses in a conference room, handshakes, lawyers, photos, noise. People congratulated Caleb like he had reached the top of a mountain. That night alone in his apartment, he opened an old photo on his phone. Harold stood in the driveway of the Alder Street house, wearing a faded gray work shirt, one hand resting on the hood of an old Ford pickup. Caleb had taken the picture the summer before he left. His father looked younger then, still tired, but solid. Present. Caleb stared at the photo for a long time. Then he booked a flight home. He did not tell Denise. He wanted to surprise his father. 2 weeks later, Caleb landed at Seattle-Tacoma International just after sunset. The sky was low and silver, the kind of northwest evening that made every road shine. A hired driver waited outside baggage claim, holding a small sign with Caleb's name. The car was black quiet and too expensive. Caleb sat in the back and watched the city slide past the window. He had planned the moment in his head during the whole flight. He would step onto the porch. Harold would open the door. Maybe he would pretend not to be emotional. Maybe he would say something dry like, "Took you long enough." Then Caleb would laugh, and maybe for once he would not rush away. He had brought gifts, but they suddenly felt silly. A watch Harold would probably never wear. A warm coat. A folder with paperwork for a full-time home caregiver already paid for. The driver turned off the highway and took a smaller road toward the old neighborhood. Caleb leaned forward slightly. The streets grew familiar, then unfamiliar again. New apartment buildings sat where empty lots used to be. A coffee shop had replaced the old tire place. The church billboard was gone. Then the car slowed near a dead intersection. On the right stood an abandoned gas station. The roof over the pumps was rusted through. The convenience store windows were covered in plywood. Weeds grew through the cracks in the asphalt. Someone had spray painted a red symbol across the side wall, and rain had dragged it down in streaks. Caleb barely looked at it at first. Then he saw movement behind the building. A tarp shifted. A hand appeared thin and trembling, pulling the edge of the plastic closer against the wind. Caleb frowned. "Slow down," he said. The driver glanced in the mirror. "Sir, slow down." The car rolled forward a few more feet. From that angle, Caleb could see behind the cracked concrete barrier near the dumpster enclosure. There was a shopping cart with plastic bags tied to the sides. A cardboard box, a pair of worn boots set carefully beside a folded blanket, and under the tarp, an old man. Caleb's chest tightened before his mind understood why. Something about the posture, the gray hair, the way the man's left hand curled slightly inward, the same way Harold's hand had curled after years of gripping tools. "No," Caleb whispered. The driver stopped at the red light. Caleb opened the door before the car fully settled. "Sir, wait," but Caleb was already out. Cold air hit him. The smell of wet pavement, stale gasoline, and garbage rose around him. He walked fast at first, then slower because some part of him was begging the world to be wrong. The old man stirred. Caleb stepped around the concrete wall. The man blinked up at him. His beard was overgrown. His cheeks had hollowed. His jacket was too thin for the weather. But his eyes were the same. Harold Mercer's eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Caleb felt something break inside him. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet crack deep enough to change everything. Dad Harold's face changed. Not relief, fear, then shame. He tried to sit up too quickly, grabbing at the tarp, as if he could hide the blanket, the cart, the whole ruined scene behind him. "Caleb," he said, his voice rough from cold. "You weren't supposed to come." Caleb dropped to one knee on the wet concrete. His expensive coat brushed the dirty ground, and he did not care. "What happened to you?" Harold looked away. Behind them, the traffic light turned green. The hired car waited with its hazard lights blinking. Somewhere in the distance, a siren passed and faded. Caleb reached for his father's arm, but Harold pulled back just a little. That small movement hurt more than anything Caleb had seen. "Dad," Caleb said softer now. "I've been sending money. Denise said you were okay. She said the house was fine." Harold closed his eyes. The name did something to him. It passed across his face like pain. "Please," Harold whispered. Caleb leaned closer. "Please what?" Harold finally looked at him. His eyes were wet, but his voice was firm in a way Caleb remembered from childhood, from scraped knees and broken bike chains and hard lessons at the kitchen table. "Don't look into this, son." Caleb stared at him. Harold swallowed. Then he said the words that made the night feel colder. "Some truths don't give a family back. They only show you who took it away." Caleb did not answer right away. He stayed on one knee beside his father, staring at the man who had once carried transmissions across a garage floor like they weighed nothing. Harold Mercer used to smell like motor oil coffee and winter air. He used to stand straight even when his back hurt. He used to fix other people's cars for free when they were short on money, then come home and tell his children never to make a poor man beg for dignity. Now he was sitting behind an abandoned gas station, trying to hide a torn blanket from his own son. Caleb felt anger rise inside him, but it had nowhere clean to go. Not yet. So he swallowed it down and took off his coat. "Put this on," he said. Harold shook his head. "I'm fine. You're not fine." "Caleb." "Dad, please." Something in his voice made Harold stop resisting. Caleb wrapped the coat around his father's shoulders and helped him stand. Harold was lighter than he should have been. Too light. His body leaned before he caught himself. Caleb felt the tremor in his arm and tightened his grip, but not too much. He did not want his father to feel handled. The driver stood by the car, unsure whether to look away or help. Caleb told him to open the door. Harold looked at the black SUV, then down at his own boots, muddy and split at the edges. "I'll stain the seats," Harold muttered. Caleb almost broke then. "They're seats," he said. "You're my father." Harold said nothing after that. He let Caleb guide him into the back. The shopping cart stayed behind the gas station, filled with the small wreckage of a life Caleb had not known existed. A dented thermos, a grocery bag of clothes, a folded Bible in a freezer bag, a flashlight tied with tape. Caleb saw all of it. He wanted to load every piece into the car, as if gathering the objects could gather the years too. But Harold touched his wrist. "Leave it." "Dad, please, just leave it for now." Caleb nodded, though it hurt. He closed the door gently and got in beside him. The driver pulled back onto the road. For several minutes, nobody spoke. The city moved outside the windows, wet and blurred. Caleb kept glancing at Harold's hands. The nails were dirty. The knuckles were cracked. There was a small bandage wrapped around one thumb, gray from use. Caleb remembered those hands lifting him onto a bicycle, tightening a loose chain, pressing a cold washcloth to his forehead when he had the flu as a boy. He had sent money for years, and still those hands had ended up reaching for warmth behind a gas station. "Where are we going?" Harold asked. "A hotel." "No." "Yes. I don't need that. You need a bed, a shower, food, and a doctor." Harold looked out the window. "I said don't look into it." I heard you, then hear me again. Caleb turned toward him. I flew halfway across the world thinking you were home. I found you sleeping behind a closed gas station. You don't get to ask me not to ask questions. Harold's jaw worked slightly. He looked older in the passing light. Older than 72. Older than Caleb had allowed himself to imagine. I made choices, Harold said quietly. Did you choose to be out there? Harold did not answer. That silence told Caleb more than any confession could have. The hotel was near the waterfront, clean, but not flashy. Caleb chose it because it had private entrances, a small restaurant, and a front desk staff that would not stare too much. Still, Harold stiffened when they walked in. His hair was tangled. His jeans were dirty. Caleb could feel people noticing. Not cruelly, not openly, but noticing. Harold felt it too. His shoulders curled inward, and that small change did something terrible to Caleb's chest. He stepped closer to his father, making it clear without saying a word that Harold was with him, that no one had the right to look down on him. The clerk was polite. She gave them 2 key cards and asked if they needed anything else. Caleb asked for hot soup sandwiches, coffee, and extra towels to be sent up. In the room, Harold stood just inside the door, like he was afraid to touch anything. The carpet was soft under his boots. The bed was turned down. A lamp glowed beside a chair near the window. Caleb set his suitcase by the wall. Bathrooms through there. Take as long as you want. Harold stared at the bathroom door. Then he looked at Caleb. You shouldn't have to see me like this. Caleb's throat tightened. I should have seen you sooner. That landed between them. Harold looked away first. While his father showered, Caleb called the front desk for a disposable razor socks and a basic set of clothes from the hotel shop. Then he sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out his phone. There were dozens of old messages from Denise. Dad's doing okay. He's just tired. He doesn't like calls lately. House needs some work, but I'm handling it. The property tax went up again. Doctor said he needs a few tests. Don't worry, Caleb. I've got him. Caleb scrolled slowly. The words looked different now. Not like updates, like locks. He called Denise. It rang 5 times before she answered. Caleb. Her voice was bright, at first surprised. Why are you calling so late? Is everything okay? I'm in Tacoma. There was a pause, a small one, but Caleb heard it. You're what I came home. You should have told me. I would have picked you up. I found Dad. The silence on the line changed shape. It became heavier. What do you mean you found Dad? Caleb stood and walked toward the window. Below, cars hissed along the wet street. Behind the old Shell station on Meridian, sleeping under a tarp. Denise exhaled sharply. Caleb, listen to me. It's not what you think. What should I think? He does this sometimes. Caleb closed his eyes. Does what he wanders. He gets confused. He refuses help. You don't understand how hard it's been. Where is the house? Another pause. Denise's voice dropped. We need to talk about that in person. No, we talk now. Caleb, Dad signed papers. He agreed to sell. I handled things because he asked me to. He asked you to sell his home. He couldn't manage it anymore. The place was falling apart. The bills were piling up. I was the one here, remember? Not you. The words hit because part of them was true. Caleb had not been there. He had sent money from airports and boardrooms. He had believed wire transfers could stand in for hands on a shoulder. But truth did not erase what he had seen. I sent enough to keep that house, he said. Money isn't magic. No. But it doesn't disappear by itself either. Denise went quiet, Before she could answer, the bathroom door opened. Harold stepped out in a white hotel robe, his wet hair combed back with his fingers. He looked cleaner, smaller, more exposed. His eyes went to the phone in Caleb's hand. "Are you talking to your sister?" Caleb did not look away from him. "Yes." Harold's face tightened with panic. "Hang up!" Denise heard him. Her voice came sharp through the speaker. "Is Dad there?" Caleb put him on. Harold moved faster than Caleb expected. He reached for the phone, not angry but desperate. "Hang up," he said. "Please." Caleb ended the call. The room fell quiet. Only the hum of the heater remained. Harold lowered himself into the chair by the window, and for the first time Caleb saw how exhausted he really was. Not tired from one bad night. Tired from carrying a secret too long. Food arrived 10 minutes later. Harold ate slowly at first, as if his body did not trust the meal. Then hunger took over. He tried to hide it, but Caleb saw. Every careful spoonful, every pause to make it look like he was not starving. Caleb sat across from him and said nothing. There are moments when love means asking questions. And there are moments when love means letting someone eat in peace. After dinner, Caleb opened his laptop. He searched the Pierce County property records for the Alder Street house. Harold saw the screen and stiffened. "Don't. I have to. Caleb, you don't have to protect Denise from the truth." Harold looked at him then, and there was a sadness in his face. Caleb did not understand yet. It isn't just Denise. Caleb's fingers paused over the keyboard. "What does that mean?" Harold pressed his lips together. For a second, Caleb thought he might finally explain. Instead, his father looked down at his own hands. "Some things started before your mother. Before you and Denise. Before this house ever belonged to us." Caleb felt the room shift around him. He typed the address anyway. The record loaded. The house on Alder Street had been sold 3 years earlier. The seller listed was Harold Mercer. The authorized representative was Denise Mercer, and the buyer's name stopped Caleb cold. Rosalind Brooks. Caleb stared at it, confused, then turned toward his father. Harold had gone pale. "Dad," Caleb said slowly, "who is Rosalind Brooks?" Harold closed his eyes like that name had reached into him and touched an old wound. Then he whispered, "That can't be right." Harold did not sleep much that night. Neither did Caleb. The room remained quiet after Harold whispered those words. That can't be right. Caleb wanted to ask 100 questions. Instead, he watched his father stare into the darkness beyond the hotel window. The city lights reflected faintly on the glass, turning Harold's face into a ghost of itself. Around 2 a.m, Caleb finally spoke. "Who is Rosalind Brooks?" Harold kept looking outside. "I don't know. You reacted like you did." A long silence followed. Then Harold slowly rubbed his hands together. "There was a girl once." Caleb turned toward him. "A girl," Harold nodded. "A little girl named Rosie." The name landed softly, but something about the way Harold said it made Caleb sit up straighter. Not like he was remembering a neighbor. Not like he was remembering a friend. Like he was remembering someone he had spent a lifetime missing. "Who was Rosie?" Caleb asked. Harold swallowed. "My daughter." The room seemed to shrink. For a moment, Caleb thought he had heard wrong. "Your daughter?" Harold nodded again. "My first daughter." Caleb stared at him. He had spent 39 years believing he knew his family. He knew every story about his grandparents, every story about his mother, every story about Denise. And somehow there had been a daughter, a sister, an entire human being, and nobody had ever spoken her name. Dad. What are you talking about? Harold closed his eyes. The pain on his face was old, much older than the gas station, much older than Denise, much older than the house. Before I met your mother, I was married once before. Caleb said nothing. I was 24. Her name was Evelyn. Harold's voice softened when he said it. We had Rosie 2 years later. For a moment, Caleb saw something change in him. The exhausted homeless man disappeared. In his place was a young father remembering the happiest part of his life. She had red curls, Harold said quietly. She followed me everywhere. Into the garage. Into the yard. She wanted to help me fix things even though she was too little to hold a screwdriver. A faint smile appeared, then vanished. Evelyn got sick. The smile was gone now. She died when Rosie was 6. The room became silent again. Caleb felt a heaviness settling inside him. Harold continued. After the funeral, everything fell apart. Evelyn's parents blamed Harold. They thought he wasn't good enough. Too poor. Too stubborn. Too blue-collar. They wanted Rosie with them. Harold fought, for a while, but he was working 2 jobs, paying medical bills, trying to survive. Then lawyers got involved, family court, paperwork, meetings, things he barely understood. I thought I still had time, Harold said. I thought I'd fix it. His voice cracked. But one day she was gone. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. What do you mean, gone? They took her. Harold rubbed his forehead. Her grandparents moved. Nobody would tell me where. You never found her, I tried. The answer came immediately. Too immediately, like Harold had repeated it to himself for decades. I looked for years. Caleb believed him, because he could hear the shame. Not the shame of a man who didn't try, the shame of a man who tried and failed. There was a difference, a huge one. What happened after that? Harold leaned back. I met your mother. His expression softened. She saved me. Caleb smiled sadly. That sounded like Margaret Mercer. She had always been the kind of woman who made broken people feel seen. We built a life. Harold continued. You were born. Then Denise. For a moment, the story felt familiar again. Then Harold looked toward the laptop screen, toward the name still displayed there. Rosalind Brooks. Every year I searched. Caleb frowned. What, every year? Harold's eyes never left the screen. I hired investigators when I could afford it. Sometimes I drove hundreds of miles following tips. Sometimes I thought I found her. Sometimes I thought I heard her voice. Caleb sat frozen. All those years, all those Christmases, all those birthdays, and underneath it all, his father had been carrying another loss. One nobody ever talked about. One Caleb had never even known existed. Why didn't you tell us? Harold laughed softly. A tired laugh. What was I supposed to say? Caleb didn't answer. Your mother knew, Harold said. She knew everything. Denise knew. Harold hesitated, then nodded. Some of it. That answer stayed with Caleb. Some of it. Not all. Some. The next morning, Caleb woke before sunrise. Harold was asleep in the bed across the room. For the first time since finding him, he looked peaceful. Older, fragile, but peaceful. Caleb quietly grabbed his laptop. He needed answers. The property records led him to more records. The county assessor's office, the deed transfer, the sale agreement. Everything was public. Everything looked legal. That was what bothered him. Nothing looked stolen. Nothing looked forged. The house had genuinely been sold. 3 years earlier. Seller Harold Mercer. Authorized representative Denise Mercer. Buyer Rosalind Brooks. Purchase price. Closing date. Tax records. Everything. Caleb stared at the documents. Then something caught his eye. The mailing address attached to Rosalind Brooks. Tacoma. Less than 20 minutes away. His pulse quickened. For 30 years, Harold had searched for Rosie. Now a woman named Rosalind Brooks owned his house. A woman whose first name could easily have been shortened to Rosie. And Harold reacted to the name like someone had stabbed him. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe. But Caleb no longer believed much in coincidence. By 9 in the morning, he was driving. The address led to a quiet residential neighborhood. Not wealthy, not poor. The kind of neighborhood built for teachers, nurses, and working families. Small front yards, flower pots, children's bicycles, American flags. Normal life. The house belonged to a woman in her 60s, a widow according to public records. Elementary school teacher. No criminal history. No lawsuits. No obvious connection to Harold Mercer. Which somehow made Caleb even more curious. He parked across the street. The house itself was modest. White siding, blue shutters, a vegetable garden near the fence. Nothing remarkable. Then the front door opened. A woman stepped outside carrying a box. Gray hair, gentle face, practical clothes. She looked completely ordinary. She certainly didn't look like the answer to a 30-year-old mystery. A little boy ran out behind her. Around 10 years old. "Grandma, wait." She laughed. "Careful, Noah." The sound of her laugh surprised Caleb. It felt warm, easy, like someone who spent her life around children. The boy grabbed one side of the box. Together they carried it toward a pickup truck parked in the driveway. The truck bed was already filled with paint cans and lumber. Caleb watched for several minutes. Then he noticed something written on one of the signs leaning against the truck. Future home of the Alder Street Learning Center. His breath caught. Alder Street, Harold's old address. Rosalind Brooks wasn't just the owner. She was renovating the house. For children. Caleb sat there trying to understand what he was seeing. Then the boy accidentally dropped a folder. Papers scattered across the driveway. Rosalind bent down to help gather them. One sheet slipped free and flipped over in the wind. A photograph slid halfway out. An old photograph. Faded. Worn. Black and white. The woman quickly picked it up. But not before Caleb saw it. A little girl, about 6 years old, standing beside a man. The girl's curls were bright even in the faded image, and the man's face looked hauntingly familiar. Caleb stopped breathing, because the man in that photograph looked exactly like Harold Mercer, and the little girl looked exactly the age Rosie would have been when she disappeared. Caleb sat in his car for almost 10 minutes after Rosalind Brooks disappeared back inside the house. The photograph would not leave his mind. A little girl, red curls, a man who looked exactly like Harold, 30 years younger. The image had flashed past for only a second, but it was enough. Enough to make his pulse race. Enough to make him question whether he was standing at the edge of something much bigger than a property dispute. Eventually, he got out of the car. He walked across the street, slowly giving himself one last chance to turn around. This could be nothing. A coincidence. A resemblance. A story he wanted to be true. But something inside him kept pushing forward. He knocked on the door. A moment later, Rosalind opened it. Up close, she looked older than he had expected. Maybe 62 or 63. Her face carried the soft wear of someone who had spent years listening more than speaking. the kind of face children trusted. She looked surprised, but not alarmed. "Can I help you?" Caleb smiled politely. "I hope so. My name is Caleb Mercer." The surname caused no reaction, none at all. "My apologies for stopping by unannounced," he said. "I was hoping to ask about a property you purchased a few years ago." "The Alder Street house, yes." Recognition crossed her face. "Oh, you're connected to the previous owner." Caleb nodded. "My father was." Something changed in her expression. Not suspicion. Sadness. Just for a second. "Please come in." The house felt warm. Lived in. Family photographs lined the walls. School drawings hung on the refrigerator. A half-finished science project sat on the dining room table. Nothing expensive. Nothing impressive. But there was something deeply comforting about it. The kind of home built through years rather than money. Rosalind led him to the kitchen. "Coffee, yes, thank you." As she prepared it, Caleb studied the room. Children's books, teacher planners, a stack of student essays. This was not a woman who had bought Harold's house to flip it for profit. That much was obvious. "I heard your father isn't living there anymore," Rosalind said carefully. Caleb looked up. "You knew him, no?" She shook her head. "I only met him once." Caleb froze. "You met him a few years ago." Rosalind sat down across from him. He looked tired. Her voice softened. Very tired. Caleb felt his chest tighten. What happened? The house was already under contract. Rosalind hesitated. "I remember him standing in the driveway." She stared into her coffee. "I don't know why I remember it so clearly." The memory seemed to bother her. He looked heartbroken. Caleb said nothing. Rosalind continued. "I almost backed out." "Why didn't you?" A sad smile appeared. "Because I wasn't buying it for myself." That matched what Caleb had seen outside. The sign, the renovation materials, the plans, the learning center. Rosalind nodded. "There aren't many affordable after-school programs in this area anymore." She looked around the kitchen. "I spent 35 years teaching elementary school. Some kids need somewhere safe to go after class." The sincerity in her voice was impossible to fake. Caleb believed her immediately. For the first time since coming home, his anger had nowhere to land. This woman wasn't the enemy. If anything, she seemed like someone Harold himself would have respected. Then Noah burst into the kitchen. "Grandma, where's my backpack?" Rosalind pointed toward the hallway. The boy spotted Caleb. Hi, you look rich." Rosalind nearly choked on her coffee. "Noah, what?" he asked innocently. Caleb laughed despite himself. "Fair observation." The boy shrugged. "You have expensive shoes." Then he disappeared. For the first time in days, Caleb smiled. Children had a way of cutting through nonsense. When Noah was gone, Rosalind rolled her eyes. "He says whatever he thinks." "Honestly, I kind of respect that." She laughed. The sound felt strangely familiar. Not because Caleb had heard it before. Because Harold laughed the same way. Quiet, gentle, almost apologetic. The realization sent a chill through him. He carefully changed direction. "How long have you lived in Tacoma? Most of my life." "Family nearby, a few." She paused. "My husband passed away 8 years ago." "I'm sorry." "Thank you." Her eyes drifted toward a framed photograph near the window. A smiling man. A younger version of her. A teenage daughter. A little boy. Life. Ordinary life. The kind people build while carrying wounds nobody else sees. Caleb glanced again toward the hallway. Then he took a chance. "I saw a photograph outside earlier." Rosalind stiffened slightly. Which one, the black and white one? Something changed immediately. A small tension. Not fear, something closer to protectiveness. That picture is old. Who's in it? Rosalind was quiet, long enough that Caleb worried he had pushed too hard. Finally, she stood. Without speaking, she walked toward a cabinet, opened a drawer, pulled out a worn photograph. The same one. She placed it gently on the table. Caleb looked down. This time there was no doubt. The man was Harold, younger, maybe 30, holding the hand of a little girl with bright curls. Rosie. It had to be Rosie. Who are they? Caleb asked softly. Rosalind looked at the photograph for several seconds. I don't know. The answer surprised him. What do you mean? She touched the corner of the picture. This was the only photograph I had when I was adopted. The room went silent. Caleb felt every muscle in his body tighten. Adopted. He kept his face neutral. Barely. I was 6 when my adoptive parents brought me home. Rosalind spoke calmly, like someone describing a story she had repeated many times. My records were incomplete. Most of them were sealed. The state only provided basic information. Caleb struggled to breathe normally. Do you know who the little girl is? A sad smile appeared. That's me. The words landed like a hammer. Rosalind continued. I used to stare at this picture for hours. She laughed softly. Kids invent stories when they don't have answers. What kind of stories? That the man was my father? Her eyes lowered. Or maybe my uncle. Or someone who loved me. The last part came out almost as a whisper. Caleb looked away. Because suddenly this wasn't about records, or property, or money. It was about a little girl who had grown into a woman without knowing where she came from. A woman who still kept a single photograph decades later. Not because she remembered, because she didn't. And the not knowing never fully went away. My adoptive parents were wonderful, Rosalind said. I want to be clear about that. I had a good childhood, but, she smiled sadly. There is always a but. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Then Caleb asked the question he already knew the answer to. What was your name before the adoption? Rosalind frowned. Why, just curious. She looked at him carefully, then answered. Rosie. Everything inside Caleb stopped. Not exploded. Stopped. The room, the coffee, the ticking clock. All of it disappeared. Rosie. Not could be. Not maybe. Rosie. His father's Rosie. His father's lost daughter. His sister, sitting 3 feet away, talking about after-school programs, completely unaware. Caleb forced himself to stay calm. If he said the wrong thing now, everything could break. Rosalind noticed the change in his face. Are you okay? Yeah. The lie sounded weak. She studied him. You look like you've seen a ghost. In a way he had. Not a ghost. A missing piece. A person who should have been at every birthday. Every Christmas. Every family photo. Someone erased before he was even born. Caleb stood. He needed air. He needed time. Most of all, he needed to talk to Harold. Thank you for speaking with me. Rosalind seemed confused by the sudden shift. You found what you were looking for. Caleb looked at her. At the woman who carried his father's eyes without realizing it. At the photograph on the table. At the life built on incomplete truths. Maybe he said quietly. Or maybe I just found something bigger. That evening he returned to the hotel. Harold was sitting near the window, waiting. The moment Caleb walked inside, his father looked up. What happened? Caleb placed the photograph on the table between them. Harold stared. Then his face lost all color. His hands began shaking. Not slightly. Violently. Dad. Harold picked up the photograph. His fingers trembled across the image. A sound escaped him. Half breath, half sob. Then Caleb said the words that changed everything. I found Rosie. And Harold slowly sank back into his chair, looking as if the past had just walked through the door. Harold did not speak for a long time after Caleb said the words. I found Rosie. The photograph remained in his trembling hands. His eyes moved over the image again and again, as if he were afraid it might disappear if he looked away. Finally, he whispered, She's alive. Caleb nodded. As far as I can tell. Harold's lower lip trembled. For years he had imagined this moment. 1,000 versions of it. A phone call, a letter, a knock on the door. A stranger with answers. Now that it had happened, he looked almost terrified. Does she know, he asked? No. The answer seemed to hit him harder than the first one. Harold lowered his head. For a moment, Caleb thought he might cry. Instead, he simply sat there staring at the floor. The silence stretched. Then Harold quietly said something Caleb would never forget. I stopped hoping 10 years ago. The words carried no drama, no self-pity, just exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who had carried grief so long, it became part of his identity. I kept looking after your mother died, Harold continued. Then one day I realized I was searching for a little girl who no longer existed. His fingers tightened around the photograph. She would have been a woman by then. Caleb sat beside him. Neither man spoke for several minutes. Sometimes grief didn't need words. Sometimes it only needed company. Eventually, Caleb asked the question that had been bothering him all day. Dad. Why did Denise know about Rosie? Harold looked up. A shadow crossed his face. Because she found the photographs when she was young. How young? 12. Maybe 13. Harold sighed. She asked questions. What did you tell her? The truth? Caleb frowned. All of it. No. Harold shook his head. Not all. The answer lingered. Not all. The same phrase again. Pieces of truth, missing pieces, half stories. The kind that often damaged families more than outright lies. The next morning, Caleb began digging deeper. He hired a local attorney. Not because he wanted a lawsuit, because he needed records. Real records. The attorney specialized in family law and adoption cases. Her office occupied the second floor of an old brick building downtown. By noon, she was already reviewing public documents. By evening, she called him back. What you found is unusual. Caleb leaned forward. How unusual? The adoption records themselves remain sealed. But there are court references connected to the case. His pulse quickened. Go on. There were custody disputes. There were multiple filings. There were requests for visitation. Caleb sat very still. Those did not sound like the actions of a man who abandoned his daughter. They sounded like the actions of someone trying to keep her. Can you get more? Possibly. The attorney hesitated. However, some names keep appearing. What names? She gave him one. The name meant nothing at first. Then everything clicked. The surname. It belonged to Denise's maternal grandfather, the father of Harold's second wife, Margaret's father. Caleb froze. Why would he be involved? That's what I'd like to know. The call ended. Caleb sat alone in the hotel room, trying to make sense of it. The timeline didn't fit. Margaret hadn't entered Harold's life until years after Rosie disappeared. So why was her father connected to legal filings involving Rosie? It made no sense. Unless there was more to the story. A lot more. That evening, Caleb drove to Denise's house. For the first time since returning home, the property sat in a newer subdivision outside Tacoma. Large homes, wide driveways, fresh landscaping, nothing extravagant, but far nicer than anything Harold had ever lived in. The contrast made him angry. Not because Denise had a nice house, because Harold had been sleeping behind a gas station while she lived there. She opened the door before he knocked. Apparently, she had been watching through the window. "You shouldn't have come here." Caleb stared at her. "That's your opening line. You look tired." "I found Dad behind a gas station." Her face tightened. "Lower your voice." The response shocked him. Not concern, not guilt. Embarrassment. Inside the house was immaculate. New furniture, updated kitchen, fresh paint, family photos. Everything looked stable, normal, the kind of life people built when their biggest problems were school schedules and grocery lists, not abandoned fathers. Caleb stepped into the living room. How long Denise folded her arms. How long what? How long did you know she looked away? That was answer enough. You knew he wasn't living in the house. Silence. You knew. "I tried helping him." The words came out fast. Defensive. He wouldn't listen. He kept making bad decisions. Caleb laughed bitterly. What decision led him behind a gas station? Denise's face hardened. "You think you're the hero because you flew home?" The attack surprised him. "You weren't here. There it is." She pointed at him. "You weren't here." The room grew tense. For the first time, Caleb saw something beneath the surface. Not greed, not yet. Pain, old pain, the kind people buried until it twisted into something ugly. "I took Mom to chemo appointments." Denise's voice shook. "I handled Dad's medications. I fixed plumbing. I dealt with property taxes. I cleaned up after every crisis." Caleb listened, because part of it was true, painfully true. "But somehow you're the villain." "No," Caleb said quietly. "The villain is whoever left Dad homeless." Denise's eyes flashed. Then something slipped out. Something she clearly hadn't intended to say. Maybe if he'd spent less time mourning Rosie. She stopped. Too late. Caleb felt the room freeze. "What did you just say?" Denise looked horrified. Not because she had spoken, because she had revealed too much. "Nothing. You knew." Silence. "You knew about Rosie." Denise looked away. That told him everything. The conversation ended soon afterward. Neither trusted themselves enough to continue. But as Caleb walked back toward his car, a thought refused to leave him. Denise wasn't acting like someone protecting a secret for money. She was acting like someone carrying resentment. Deep resentment. The kind that grew for decades. That night, Caleb returned to the hotel. Harold was asleep. For once. Peacefully asleep. Caleb didn't wake him. Instead, he sat at the desk reviewing everything again. Property records, court references, custody filings, old names, old dates, old wounds. The puzzle pieces were beginning to align. Then his attorney called again. Late. Too late for good news. Caleb answered immediately. "What happened?" The woman sounded unsettled. "I found additional court correspondence." His stomach tightened. "About Rosie, yes. What does it say?" A pause. "Then it strongly suggests your father never stopped fighting for visitation." Caleb closed his eyes. He had known it. Somehow he had known it. The attorney continued. "There's something else. What the court wasn't receiving responses from the child's guardians. meaning letters were disappearing. Caleb sat upright. What letters? The ones your father kept sending. The room suddenly felt colder. Are you saying Rosie never got them? I don't know. The attorney paused, but somebody appears to have made sure they never arrived. The call ended minutes later. Caleb sat frozen. For 30 years, Harold believed Rosie had vanished. For 30 years, Rosie believed Harold abandoned her. And now evidence suggested neither story was true. Someone had stood between them. Someone had kept them apart. Someone had wanted them separated. Caleb looked toward his sleeping father, then toward the growing stack of documents. And for the first time he realized the real mystery wasn't where Rosie had gone. The real mystery was who had spent 3 decades making sure she never came home. Caleb barely slept. The attorney's words stayed with him all night. Somebody appears to have made sure they never arrived. Every time he closed his eyes, he pictured Harold writing letters, folding them carefully, addressing envelopes, buying stamps he could barely afford, standing at a mailbox, believing his daughter might finally hear from him. And somewhere along the way, those letters vanished. Not by accident, by design. Morning arrived gray and cold. Harold was already awake. He sat by the window holding the old photograph of Rosie. The picture looked fragile now. The edges were worn smooth from years of being handled. Caleb watched his father stare at it. Not with hope, with grief. The kind grief that survives even after hope dies. Did you write to her often? Caleb asked. Harold nodded. For years. How many letters? A sad smile crossed his face. I stopped counting. He looked down at the photograph. Birthdays, Christmas, school graduations I never saw. Days when I missed her. His voice remained calm. That somehow made it worse. Caleb pulled a chair closer. Did she ever answer? Harold shook his head. No. What did you think happened? Harold looked out the window. At first I thought her grandparents were hiding the letters. Then I thought she hated me. The answer landed heavily, because it sounded exactly like something a lost child might think too. A father believed his daughter hated him. A daughter probably believed her father abandoned her. 2 lives damaged by the same lie. Neither knowing the other was suffering. Caleb suddenly understood why Harold had looked so broken behind that gas station. The house wasn't the deepest wound. Rosie was. Always Rosie. That afternoon, Caleb met his attorney again. This time she had more documents. Old court references, archived correspondence, public records that nobody had bothered to revisit for decades. She spread everything across a conference table. Here's what we know. Caleb listened carefully. The timeline unfolded piece by piece. After Evelyn died, Harold petitioned repeatedly for visitation. He attended hearings, submitted requests, paid filing fees, appeared whenever the court required it. Nothing about the records suggested abandonment. Quite the opposite. He kept fighting. The attorney tapped a document, long after most people would have given up. Caleb nodded slowly. That sounded like Harold. Stubborn, quiet, persistent. What happened then? The attorney slid another file toward him. That's where things get strange. Several letters referenced communication failures, missed notices, returned mail, unanswered requests. One judge had even noted concern that family members weren't cooperating with visitation efforts. Caleb frowned. Which family members? The attorney pointed to a surname, the same surname she'd mentioned the day before, Denise's maternal grandfather, Walter Grayson. Caleb stared. Walter had died nearly 15 years earlier. He remembered him vaguely, a stern man, controlling, opinionated, the kind of grandfather children obeyed more than loved. What was he doing involved in this? The attorney leaned back. I can't prove anything, but his name appears repeatedly, too repeatedly. A chill moved through Caleb. Walter Grayson, Margaret's father, Denise's grandfather, someone who hadn't even entered Harold's life until after Rosie disappeared. Or had he, Caleb, took copies of everything? Questions were multiplying faster than answers. That evening, he drove to Denise's house again. This time, she didn't seem surprised, almost as if she'd been expecting him. She opened the door without speaking. How much did Grandpa know? Caleb asked. Denise immediately stiffened. The reaction told him everything, more than he should have. Caleb stepped inside. How much more? Denise crossed her arms. You don't understand. Then help me understand. She laughed bitterly, a tired laugh, not an amused one. You really think you're uncovering some giant conspiracy? Tell me I'm wrong. Denise didn't answer. Instead, she walked toward the kitchen. For several moments, neither spoke. Then she opened a cabinet and took out 2 glasses. Not because she wanted a drink, because she needed something to do with her hands. My grandfather hated Dad. The confession came quietly. Caleb blinked. What, he always hated him? Why? Because Mom married him. The answer sounded too simple. Denise shook her head. No, he hated what Dad represented. She stared down at the countertop. Working class, no college, no money. He thought Mom deserved someone better. That sounded painfully believable. Caleb had met men like Walter before. People who measured human value through status. People who never understood dignity. Did Mom know? Denise hesitated. I don't think she knew everything. The wording caught Caleb's attention. Everything. Not anything. Everything. There was more. Much more. You do know something. Denise looked exhausted suddenly, years older than she had looked before. The anger remained, but underneath it was something else. Weariness. I grew up hearing Rosie this, Rosie that. Caleb said nothing. My father never stopped talking about her. Her voice cracked. He kept her photos. He kept letters. He kept memories. He kept grief. She swallowed hard, and every time he looked sad, I knew why. The room became quiet, not because Caleb agreed, because for the first time he could see the wound, not the excuse. The wound. A little girl growing up beside a ghost. A father physically present but emotionally trapped in another loss. That kind of thing leaves marks. Still. It didn't justify what happened. Not even close. That doesn't explain the house. No. Denise's eyes lowered. It doesn't. For the first time, she sounded ashamed. A real crack in the armor. Then she said something unexpected. I never thought he'd end up homeless. Caleb stared. What, I thought he'd stay with friends or move somewhere. Her voice grew smaller. I didn't think. She stopped, because now she heard how awful it sounded. The problem wasn't that she intended harm. The problem was that she stopped paying attention. Neglect rarely begins with cruelty. Sometimes it begins with looking away. Too long. Too often. Caleb left shortly afterward. He couldn't process any more. His anger remained, but now it had become complicated. Denise wasn't a monster. She was damaged. And damaged people sometimes damaged others, especially family, especially the people closest to them. When he returned to the hotel, Harold wasn't there. Panic hit immediately. The room was empty, the bed untouched, the photograph gone. Caleb called his phone, no answer. His chest tightened. For one terrible moment, he imagined Harold back behind the gas station. Then the front desk called. A clerk had seen an elderly man walking toward the waterfront. Caleb drove there immediately. He found Harold sitting alone on a bench overlooking Commencement Bay. The old photograph rested in his lap. The ocean stretched gray and endless beyond him. For several minutes, Caleb simply sat beside him. Neither spoke. Eventually, Harold broke the silence. "She has children." Caleb nodded. "A daughter, a grandson." A faint smile appeared, then disappeared. "I missed everything." The words were barely audible. Caleb looked at him, at the years carved into his face, at the regret, at the loneliness, at the quiet dignity that somehow survived all of it. "No," Caleb said softly. "You missed a lot." Harold nodded. A tear slid down one cheek, the first Caleb had ever seen from his father. Then Harold suddenly pressed a hand against his chest. His expression changed. Pain. Sharp. Immediate. The photograph slipped from his lap. Dad Harold leaned forward. His breathing became uneven. Harold, the color drained from his face. And as Caleb reached for him, the old man collapsed sideways on the bench, clutching his chest, while the photograph of Rosie fluttered onto the wet pavement below. The ambulance arrived in less than 10 minutes. For Caleb, it felt like an hour. He rode beside his father to the hospital, watching every movement the paramedics made, every monitor beep, every glance between medical professionals who had seen too many families like this. Harold remained conscious. Barely, but conscious. The photograph of Rosie stayed clenched in his hand the entire ride, even when a paramedic suggested setting it aside. Even when his fingers trembled, he refused to let go. By the time they reached the emergency department, night had settled over Tacoma. Tests came first. Blood work, scans, monitoring, questions, then more waiting. Hospitals had their own rhythm. People entered terrified, then sat beneath fluorescent lights while machines decided what came next. Just after midnight, a cardiologist finally spoke with Caleb. It wasn't a major heart attack. The relief nearly knocked him over. But it was serious. The doctor folded his hands. His body has been under significant stress. Malnutrition, exposure to cold, untreated medical issues, emotional strain. The list felt like an indictment, not against one person, against everyone who had failed to notice, including Caleb. When the doctor left, Caleb sat alone outside Harold's room. The guilt was relentless. He had spent years convincing himself that financial support was enough, that success could compensate for absence. Now his father was lying in a hospital bed after months of living behind an abandoned gas station. Money had never been the problem. Distance had. A few hours later, Harold finally woke. The room was dim. The photograph rested on the bedside table. Caleb stood immediately. "How are you feeling, tired?" The answer sounded honest. Harold looked around the room, then toward the photograph, then toward Caleb. "Did I die?" Caleb almost laughed. "No." "Good." Harold closed his eyes again. "I still need to meet my daughter." The words hit harder than anything else, not because they were dramatic, because they were simple. The wish of an old man who had lost 30 years. The next morning, Caleb made a decision. No more secrets. No more delays. He called Rosalind. She answered after the second ring. "Hello, Rosalind. It's Caleb." Her voice immediately grew concerned. "Is everything okay?" "No." He took a breath. "My father is in the hospital." Silence. Then, "I'm sorry to hear that." Caleb stared through the hospital window. Rain tapped softly against the glass. There are things I need to tell you. Another pause. What things? Caleb hesitated. This conversation could change lives. There was no perfect way to begin. No matter what happens after this, he said carefully, I think you deserve the truth. 3 hours later, Rosalind arrived. She did not come alone. Noah walked beside her carrying a backpack almost as large as himself. The boy looked nervous. Hospitals did that to children. The smell, the machines, the uncertainty. Caleb met them in the lobby. Rosalind's face looked pale, not frightened exactly. More like someone approaching a door she had avoided opening her entire life. Thank you for coming. She nodded. You sounded serious. I was. Noah looked between them. Is someone sick? My father. The boy frowned. Your dad? Yeah. Noah adjusted his backpack. My grandpa got sick before he died. Rosalind gently touched his shoulder. The gesture carried years of love. Years Harold had never seen. Caleb felt his chest tighten. They rode the elevator together. Nobody said much. The closer they got to Harold's room, the quieter everything became. Rosalind finally stopped walking. The hallway stretched ahead. White walls, soft lights. Nurses moving quietly between rooms. What exactly is happening? She asked. Caleb looked at her, then handed her a folder. Inside were copies of the photograph, copies of the court filings, copies of records he and the attorney had uncovered. Rosalind opened it slowly. At first she only skimmed, then she started reading, then she stopped walking entirely. Several minutes passed. Her breathing changed. She turned another page, then another, then another. The color left her face. No. The word escaped before she could stop it. No. Caleb said nothing. Rosalind stared at the documents, the visitation requests, the letters, the filings, the petitions, years of effort, years of trying, years of searching. Everything she had believed about her father began collapsing in silence. I thought he left. Her voice barely existed. I know. He never came. The papers trembled in her hands. I know. Tears appeared suddenly. Not dramatic tears, confused ones. The kind that arrive when a lifelong certainty starts breaking apart. He kept looking. Caleb nodded. For decades, Rosalind sat down heavily in one of the hallway chairs. Noah moved beside her immediately. Without being asked. Without fully understanding. Children often sensed pain before they understood it. Grandma Rosalind wiped her eyes. I'm okay. Noah didn't look convinced. You're crying. That simple observation somehow made everything harder. She laughed softly through the tears. A little. The boy sat quietly beside her, then looked at the documents, then at Caleb, then at the hospital room door. His young mind was clearly trying to assemble pieces far too large for him. Finally, he asked, Is the man in there, the person from the picture? Neither adult answered immediately, which was answer enough. Noah looked confused. If he was looking for Grandma, his voice trailed off. Then came the question that stopped everyone. If he was looking for Grandma all this time, why didn't they find each other? Silence. Complete silence. Because there was no simple answer. Not one a 10-year-old could understand. Not one that made sense even to adults. Years of pride, lies, legal manipulation, lost letters, wrong assumptions, people deciding things for other people, children separated from parents, parents blamed for things they never did, entire lives altered. All of it reduced to a child's question. Why didn't they find each other? Rosalind lowered her head. For the first time since arriving, she began crying openly. Not for herself, not only. For Harold. For the young father who had spent years searching. For the little girl who had spent years believing she wasn't wanted. For all the time nobody could return. Noah wrapped his arms around her. The gesture was small, but it felt enormous. Sometimes healing began with someone simply staying close. Eventually, Rosalind stood. Her hands still shook. The folder remained pressed against her chest. Caleb waited. He would not push. This choice belonged to her, more than anyone. She looked toward Harold's room, then toward the photograph clipped to the top page, then back toward the room. Fear crossed her face, then grief, then something else. Courage, the quiet kind. The kind ordinary people find when they finally decide to face the truth. She took a slow breath. Is he awake? Caleb nodded. Most of the color had drained from his own face, because suddenly this moment was real. After 30 years, after lost letters, after court filings, after grief, after lies, after all of it. The distance between father and daughter had become a single hospital door. Rosalind looked at it for several seconds. Then she turned to Caleb. Her eyes were wet, but steady. I want to talk to him. And with those words, she took her first step toward the room where Harold Mercer was waiting, unaware that the daughter he had searched for half his life was finally on the other side of the door. Harold was awake when Rosalind entered the room. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Neither moved. The years stood between them first. 30 years of unanswered questions. 30 years of wrong assumptions. 30 years that no apology could return. Harold sat upright in the hospital bed. His hands trembled. Not from illness this time. From fear. Rosalind stopped near the foot of the bed. The folder remained tucked beneath her arm. Noah waited outside with Caleb. This moment belonged to them. Father and daughter. Nothing else. Harold stared at her face. Every line, every expression, every trace of the little girl he remembered. Rosalind stared back. The old photograph suddenly made sense now. The eyes, the smile, the shape of the jaw, things she had never noticed before, things she could no longer ignore. Finally, Harold spoke. Rosie. The name cracked apart as it left his mouth, not because he meant it dramatically, because he had not spoken it aloud in years. Rosalind closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. My name is Rosalind now. Harold nodded immediately. Of course. The answer carried no disappointment, only respect. Whatever life she had built belonged to her. He understood that. The room fell silent again. A nurse passed outside. A cart rolled down the hallway. Ordinary sounds. Yet inside the room, everything felt suspended. Rosalind finally sat down. Not close, but not far away either. Somewhere in between. Exactly where their relationship existed. Halfway between strangers and family. I read the records. Harold swallowed. So did I. She looked down. The letters. Harold's eyes filled instantly. I wrote hundreds. The honesty of the answer broke something inside her. Not because she doubted him anymore. Because she realized he wasn't exaggerating. He probably had. Hundreds. Birthdays, Christmases, graduations, lost years measured in envelopes. I never got them. I know. The words came out together, both carrying the same grief. Rosalind wiped her eyes. When I was young, I thought you stopped trying. Harold looked away. When I was young, I thought you'd forgotten me. The sentence hung between them. Simple, devastating, because both had suffered under the exact same lie. For decades, neither blaming the correct person, neither understanding the truth. Harold looked at her again. I never stopped. Rosalind lowered her head. For the first time, she believed it completely. Not because of the documents, because of him. The old man sitting in front of her looked exactly like someone who had carried a missing child in his heart for 30 years. No actor could fake that. No liar could sustain it for that long. Eventually, she asked the question she needed answered most. Why didn't you come find me yourself? Harold's face tightened. The answer hurt. You disappeared, Rosalind frowned. What do you mean I tried? His voice weakened. Every address I got was wrong. Every lead ended. Every trail disappeared. Confusion crossed her face. Then Caleb's attorney's words returned. Someone had made sure they never found each other. Harold looked toward the window. There came a point when I didn't know where to look anymore. His voice almost broke. I hated myself for that. Rosalind felt tears returning, because she understood something painful. Parents weren't superheroes. They could fail, become exhausted, run out of doors to knock on, run out of money, run out of hope. That reality hurt more than anger ever could. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Harold slowly reached toward the bedside table. The old photograph sat there. He handed it to her. I carried this everywhere. Rosalind stared at it. The edges were worn thin, some corners nearly gone. The back had been repaired with tape multiple times. This wasn't a keepsake. It was a lifeline. Something a man had held onto when everything else disappeared. She touched the damaged corner gently, then started crying again. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. The way people cry when they finally stop fighting reality. Hours passed, not in conversation, mostly in silence. Pieces of conversation, fragments, questions, memories, small things. Rosalind told him about her adoptive parents. Harold listened carefully, never interrupting, never trying to compete with them. When she described the people who raised her, he smiled. They sound like good people. They were. I'm glad. The answer surprised her. Many people would have been jealous, bitter. Instead, Harold looked relieved, because the thing that mattered most was that she had been loved, even if he hadn't been the one providing it. Late that afternoon, Caleb stepped outside the room to take a call. When he returned, Harold and Rosalind were looking through old photographs together. The sight nearly stopped him. Not because everything was magically fixed. It wasn't. The missing years still existed. The wounds still existed. But something had changed. The distance was shrinking, one conversation at a time. Then Caleb remembered why he'd stepped out. He carried another folder, this one thicker. He looked at Harold, then Rosalind. I found something else. Both turned toward him. The atmosphere shifted immediately. What is it? Rosalind asked. Caleb sat down. His expression had become serious again. The attorney traced more records. Harold frowned. About Rosie, about why you lost her. The room became still. Caleb opened the folder. Inside were copies of legal correspondence, court references, private investigator notes, archived records, years of buried history. What did you find? Harold asked quietly. Caleb took a breath. Your visitation requests didn't fail because of paperwork. Harold stared. They failed because someone interfered. Rosalind's face tightened. We already suspected that. Caleb nodded. Now we know who. The room suddenly felt colder. Harold looked uneasy. Rosalind gripped the photograph tighter. Caleb placed a document on the bed. One name sat highlighted near the top. Walter Grayson, Denise's grandfather, Margaret's father, Harold's former father-in-law, the man who had entered Harold's life years after Rosie disappeared. Harold's face lost color. No. Caleb nodded. He used personal connections. He influenced guardianship communications. He helped block visitation notices. He redirected correspondence. Rosalind stared at the papers. He did this, looks that way. Harold looked shattered. Not because Walter hated him. He already knew that. Because the damage had been intentional. A human choice. Not fate. Not bad luck. A decision. Someone had actively kept father and daughter apart. Rosalind sat frozen. Then another realization struck her. A worse one. One Caleb had not yet spoken aloud. She looked up slowly. If Walter knew... Her voice weakened. If Walter knew all this. Caleb nodded, already understanding. Harold did too. The room suddenly felt smaller, more dangerous, because the question hanging in the air pointed directly toward the present, toward someone still alive, toward someone who had recently sold Harold's house, toward someone who had known about Rosie for years, toward someone who might have inherited more than Walter's resentment. Rosalind looked directly at Caleb. You think Denise knew? It wasn't a question. And for the first time since returning home, Caleb could not honestly say no. Several months later, the old house on Alder Street looked completely different. Fresh paint covered the weathered walls. New windows reflected the afternoon sun. The overgrown yard had been replaced with a small playground and a community garden maintained by volunteers from the neighborhood. Children laughed where silence had once lived. For years, the house had represented loss. Now it represented something else. A second chance. Rosalind stood near the front entrance, watching a group of children carry books into what would soon become the Learning Center's library. The sign outside finally hung in its permanent place. Alder Street Learning Center. The dream she had imagined years earlier was becoming real. Not because everything had healed, not because the past had disappeared, but because people had chosen to build something useful from the pain they carried. Inside the building, one room remained different from the others. It wasn't large. Just a simple office with a comfortable chair, a desk, family photographs, and a window overlooking the playground. A small brass plaque rested beside the door. Harold's room. The first time Rosalind had shown it to him, Harold had cried. Not because of the room itself, because nobody had dedicated anything to him before. His entire life had been spent building things for other people. Working, providing, sacrificing, losing. Now for the first time, there was a place where he belonged, a place where nobody could take him away. Harold spent most afternoons there. Sometimes he helped children with reading assignments. Sometimes he fixed broken shelves or loose hinges. Sometimes he simply sat near the window and watched life continue. He moved slower now. The hospital scare had changed him. But there was something lighter in him too. The haunted look Caleb had seen behind the abandoned gas station was gone. One afternoon, Noah sat beside him with a history project spread across the desk. Grandpa Harold smiled every time he heard that title. Yeah, do you think people can get lucky twice? Harold thought about it, then looked through the window. Rosalind was outside helping two children plant flowers. Caleb was carrying boxes of donated school supplies into the building. Life, family, things he once believed were gone forever. I think sometimes life gives people another chance, he said. Noah considered that carefully, then nodded. That's better than luck. Harold laughed softly. Yeah, I think it is. Across town, another story was unfolding. The civil case moved slowly the way most real legal matters did. There were no dramatic courtroom speeches, no public humiliation, no sudden collapse, just consequences, paperwork, investigations, financial records, responsibilities. Denise eventually reached a settlement regarding the property transactions and financial decisions connected to Harold's assets. The outcome cost her money. But the deeper cost wasn't financial. It was personal. For the first time, she had to face what she had become. Months earlier, she had blamed everyone else. Harold, Rosie, Caleb, even her grandfather. Now those excuses felt smaller, less convincing. She started attending counseling, not because someone forced her, because she finally understood that resentment left untreated could poison an entire life. She visited Harold occasionally. The visits remained awkward. Healing was slower than forgiveness. But Harold never shut the door on her. He never tried to destroy her, never tried to humiliate her. He simply asked her to be honest, to take responsibility, and to stop running from the truth. Sometimes that was harder than punishment. Caleb changed too. The billionaire who once believed monthly bank transfers were enough stopped living through wire transfers and phone calls. He split his time differently now. Business still mattered, but family mattered more. He attended birthdays, school events, Sunday dinners, ordinary things. The kinds of moments he once missed without realizing their value. One evening, he sat on the porch outside the learning center, watching Harold and Rosalind work together in the garden. The sight still felt unreal. Father and daughter, together. Not perfectly, not magically, but genuinely. Rosalind still had questions. Harold still carried regret. Neither could reclaim the missing decades. Yet somehow they had stopped living inside them. That was enough. Sometimes more than enough. As the sun began to set, Rosalind joined Caleb on the porch. For a while, they simply watched Harold helping Noah assemble a birdhouse. Then she said something Caleb would remember for the rest of his life. You know what surprises me most? What she smiled. I spent years thinking the house was important. Caleb glanced toward the building, the old house. She nodded. When I bought it, I thought I was saving a building. Her eyes drifted toward Harold, but it turns out it was saving something else. Caleb followed her gaze. He understood immediately. The house had never been the real story. Not the sale, not the ownership, not the legal documents. Those things only pointed toward the wound underneath. The real story had always been a father searching for a daughter, and a daughter waiting her entire life to learn she had never been abandoned. A week later, the learning center officially opened. Families filled the building. Teachers volunteered. Neighbors donated books. Children ran through the hallways laughing. At the entrance, a framed photograph hung on the wall. The old black and white picture. A young father. A little girl with red curls. For decades, the photograph had represented loss. Now it represented reunion. A story interrupted, then continued. Harold stood beneath it during the opening ceremony, Rosalind beside him, Noah holding his hand, Caleb standing nearby. Even Denise came, quietly, without drawing attention to herself. The crowd applauded when the ribbon was cut, but Harold barely noticed. His eyes remained fixed on his daughter. After everything, after all the years, after all the mistakes, she was here. That was all that mattered. The house was never what he had been searching for. Not really. Money wasn't. Justice wasn't. Even the lost years weren't. What he had wanted all along was standing beside him. Finally found. Finally known. Finally seen. And if this story leaves you thinking about someone you've been meaning to call, maybe don't wait too long. Sometimes a single conversation can save years that can never be returned. If Harold and Rosalind's journey touched you, feel free to share your thoughts below. And join us again for another story about family loss and the moments that still have the power to bring people home.